It does not reflect well on Dan Quinn that after 2 seasons, the offensive coordinator and the defensive coordinator that he chose are gone, and not necessarily for better opportunities. Certainly it's the case with Joe Whitt. The news just broke. Ian Rappaport, I believe, from the NFL Network had it first, that Kliff Kingsbury is out. They have mutually agreed to part ways. In addition to that, he does believe that Kingsbury will be an offensive coordinator this year, if not a potential head coach. But also, just breaking moments ago, Adam Schefter reporting, and this, of course, is not a surprise at all, that Joe Whitt Jr. has been turned loose as well. So Washington is in the market for an offensive coordinator and a defensive coordinator, all in the same coaching cycle. You know, this could have been easy from my standpoint. I can only speak for myself to run it back with Kliff in 2026. I think it would have been very hard to do anything with Joe Whitt Jr. And I think, if anything, they were too late to the party on that. With that said, these will be 2 critical hires. Critical hires. You've got to find the right offensive coordinator for not just the offense as a whole, but really it's got to fit with the quarterback. Now, my belief is that almost any offense would fit with a quarterback talent like Jaden Daniels. But I am interested to see the direction they go. Are they going to go with something that Adam Peters was more familiar with in San Francisco, a Shanahan-style guy, a guy like Mike LaFleur, who is currently the OC in Los Angeles, but Sean McVay calls the plays. But could you give Mike LaFleur, Matt LaFleur's brother, an assistant head coaching position / offensive coordinator to make sure that it's an upward move? I guess you could. Defensive coordinator, Kevin Stefanski, by the way, out there, as I mentioned. I do think that he's going to have an opportunity to be a head coach. There's certainly a lot of discussion about 2 jobs in particular as it relates to Stefanski, the Giant job and the Atlanta job. So the offensive coordinator, Shanahan style availabilities aren't the greatest number that we've ever seen. I mean, Clint Kubiak looks like he could be a potential head coach as well. Seattle's offensive coordinator, part of the Shanahan, Kubiak, Kyle Shanahan, Sean McVay, the whole tree. It just continues to branch out. Defensively, we've talked about this a lot. If Raheem Morris got fired, which he did, but keep in mind, Chris Shula, the defensive coordinator for the Rams, is going to be a hot head coaching candidate in this cycle as well. So if Sean McVay loses Chris Shula, he might bring Raheem Morris back. Raheem Morris was the defensive coordinator on their Super Bowl team in 2021. So Raheem Morris, Washington or, Sean and the Rams. So he may not be available, even though he and Quinn are very tight. Jeff Ulbrich, the defensive coordinator in Atlanta, worked for Quinn in Atlanta as well. Al Harris worked for Quinn, the DB's coach in Chicago. Those DBs led the league in interceptions and takeaways this year. Al Harris is a big candidate for a defensive coordinator position. Matt Eberflus just became available. Eberflus has had a tough couple of years. There was a period of time, especially when he was in Indianapolis, that people around the league thought he was an outstanding defensive coordinator. It's not easy when you take the best defensive player on your team a few days before the regular season begins and trade him, see Micah Parsons. And then you've got a guy like Jonathan Gannon, who got fired in Arizona. Jonathan Gannon was the defensive coordinator in Philadelphia when Shane Steichen was there after, they had gotten to the Super Bowl and they both got head coaching jobs. Jonathan Gannon is, perceived to be an outstanding defensive mind. Jim Schwartz might be staying in Cleveland. I can't imagine personally on the offensive side that they moved on from Kliff without a clear vision, and not only a clear vision, but in terms of the probability of landing that person being a reality. That would be my guess. They don't seem to be super impulsive. And unless I'm really missing something, because again, I'm not sure. And Ben came on and said the same thing, that, that this was like an untenable situation between Adam Peters and Kliff Kingsbury. I don't think that that's ultimately it. I think what it is they have a different idea of what they want the offense to be. Remember, too, Kliff Kingsbury's off that Arizona salary, which he was collecting for the first 2 years here in D.C., the head coaching salary after he got fired as the head coach in Arizona. And it's very possible that to stay on, Kliff wanted a lot more money. I've not presented that into the conversation. I wish I had mentioned that with Ben. I can text him on that. But, Washington's, the Kingsbury salary's been picked up a lot by Arizona in these first 2 years here in Washington. And perhaps for him, he had the idea that after 2 years, he wanted to make his way back to a head coaching opportunity, whether it was in college or in the pros. Look, the college opportunities are all completed. So that's not happening in this particular offseason. We'll see whether or not he gets, some love in Vegas, Tennessee, possible openings for a Kliff Kingsbury. They certainly wanted him in Vegas a couple of years ago and thought they had him in Vegas a couple of years ago as the offensive coordinator. So this will be, the priority here in the offseason. I know many of you are going to be want to be focused on free agency and number 7 overall. The top 2 priorities right now are OC and DC. And why is that? Well, because Quinn's become, for better or worse, subjective, more of a CEO coach. He needs clearly an offensive coordinator. That's not who he is. Is it possible they could look at Anthony Lynn, who's on the staff? They could look at a David Blau, who's on the staff, a Brian Johnson, who's on the staff and was previously a coordinator in Philadelphia. I think I wouldn't exclude anything as a possibility, but to move on from Kliff, my guess is there's somebody that they are targeting. So we'll see. And we'll keep up with the reporting. But there you go. 301-230-0980. Let's start with Sean in D.C. Sean, go ahead. You get to swing first on now the official news that Kingsbury and Whitt Jr. are gone.
Yeah, Kevin, and I do have to say that's a bit of a turn for me, because I was going to say, how is Joe Whitt still employed by this team? All this talk about Kingsbury, but why don't we just clean up the easy stuff and get rid of Joe Whitt? But fortunately, with my nimble
we knew
mind,
that was happening.
Here,
we knew that was happening.
Sure, but do it. Dan Quinn, the leader, go ahead and lead. So to me,
they did it within 48 hours of the regular season, ending. I mean, if you wanted it done during the regular season, that's fair. But I think at that point in the season, what was the point to turn them loose then?
Sure. So a couple things here. So I would just say that this, to me, weakens the argument that injuries were the biggest cause of this thing. Now, of course they were, but it reduces the impact of it, because Dan is saying, hey, I mean, at least to Joe, he's saying you didn't coach him up well enough. This is a you problem. This is obviously the injuries were obviously the number one impact. But if that was a 70% chance before, now it goes down to 55. Of course, I'm making that up. But this is an indictment of how these players were being coached, which kind of leads me to the next point. I ran a business. You were a CEO of a business. You had investors. If the CEO, his first 2 vice presidents he hires 2 years down the road says, yeah, these guys aren't going to work out, what are the investors thinking? They probably are thinking, hey, did we hire the right CEO? That's not a crazy thing for me to think.
No, it's not. It's not. I mean, unless those in that particular business, Sean, you would agree, unless those two people that you hired were so good that they got head coaching opportunities, that would obviously be different.
Sure. Sure.
But I hear you. It does not reflect well on Dan Quinn that after 2 seasons, the offensive coordinator and the defensive coordinator that he chose are gone, and not necessarily for better opportunities. Certainly it's the case with Joe Whitt. Now, back to what you said about the injuries. I still think, defensively, they could have been coached up better. I don't know if it would have helped ultimately, but offensively, to me, in looking at this season, Kliff got a lot more out of very little. I mean, they did not suck offensively in most of their games. They really didn't. Now, there were some hellacious defensive teams they faced. Seattle, that was a disaster offensively. Minnesota, that was a disaster offensively. Green Bay, early in the season when they were healthy, that was a bit of a disaster. And Detroit, by the way, who was pretty good defensively in that moment of time, was a bit of a disaster defensively, offensively. But for the most part, he got chicken salad out of, a bunch of practice squad players and backups for much of the year. So I think without question, the offense wasn't anywhere near what it was in 2024 because of number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4 injuries. Defensively, I've said this many times, injuries were obviously impactful. But I think in looking at the whole of it, it wasn't going to be a good defense. And it was a disorganized defense in a major way, especially when Joe Whitt Jr. was the defensive coordinator. Cade in Bethesda. Cade, go ahead.
What's up, Kevin? I just wanted to kind of push back, not even on the Kliff stuff, but the Adam Peters having zero role in the outcome of last year. I think he honestly kind of balked at free agency last year, right? We had a defense that wasn't very good in 2024. You're saying
after last year. You're saying this past offseason.
This past offseason. I think that he did nothing to fix a defense that got 55 points dropped on them. There were names out there like Josh Sweat. He kind of replaced mediocre players with mediocre players like Chin with Will Harris or Fowler with Wise. And I think that his draft class that you kind of painted a pretty picture of isn't very good. I mean, if we remember the main...
I didn't paint a pretty picture. I just painted a realistic picture. The jury's out.
The big draw to us in 2024, right, was 5 picks in the top 100. If you look at it now, there's only 2 players starting out of that, and it's Aiden and Mikey. Mikey's had 1 good year, 1 down year, and we traded out of that Cooper DeJean pick to trade back and get Mikey, and I think the other pick we acquired, we took Coleman. So
yeah, I would just push back a little bit on that, just so I don't lose the thought. Coleman and Sandra still, and obviously Jaden. So 3 out of that, 6 in the top 100 were significant to a run to the NFC Championship in year 1.
I agree, but
that's half of those players.
Coleman, he immediately traded for Tunsil and then picked up Connerly in the first round of the next pick and tried to move him to left guard, which I think was a little ambitious.
Right, but he's still a contributor, and he's a decent player and a versatile player for them. Provides them at the very least with depth.
Yeah, he provides them with depth. I agree with that, but it's a 3rd round pick, and depth is. I don't think that's a solid outcome. I don't think it's anything special.
I would agree with that. It's a solid outcome, nothing special, but it's not a terrible outcome.
I don't think seeing so 2 years later. 2 of those players are starting, and Mikey's had 1 great year, 1 pretty mediocre to down year. And I think every single offensive pick he's had in the draft, outside of Connerly, hasn't helped Jaden at all. I mean, we took a 2nd-round tight end, a 3rd-round wide receiver, and a 4th-round wide receiver. I don't think anyone sees Luke or Jalen Lane becoming like bona fide wide receiver 3s, wide receiver 2s.
Agreed on that. Agreed on that. But I think taking Jalen Lane as a 4th-round potential very good to great punt returner is worth it.
I think it's a fine outcome. I mean, that's a 2nd, a 3rd, and a 4th rounder that's going towards tight end and wide receiver, and no
That's
one
all I'm
believes any
saying.
of them
The
are gonna be
outcomes
anything.
potentially could be fine in a lot of cases. And hitting on basically 36 to 37% after 3 years is successful. I'm just saying that, Cade, there's a chance that at the end of next year that they'll hit on 36 to 37% of those 14 picks. So we'll look at them, and it won't be 3 years for the draft class this year, but it will be for the 9 that were taken in 2024. And if they hit on more than a third of them, it was solid to successful.
I see that, but I think hitting on a third of them is assuming the best outcome. And I think you also got to remember where these guys got taken, because 7 of them are top 100 picks.
I agree with that. Totally agree with that. So, Jaden and so out of Jaden, Newton, Sanders-Still, Sinnott, Coleman, and McCaffrey, they got to hit with 2 significant contributors out of those 6 typically on a draft overall. Top 100, I'll give you 3 out of 6, a 50% hit rate. They need 50% of those guys to be meaningful contributors. That would be solid. Anything above that would be great. Anything below that wouldn't be great. Now, to the first thing that you talked about, and that is they didn't do enough defensively in the offseason. You know, the opportunities have to be there, too. I do think right now that, number one, had Myles Garrett actually been on the trade market, they would have gone after him. Number two, they were interested, and they did have discussions with Cincinnati about Trey Hendrickson. Number three is Dietrich Wise actually was exactly what they were looking for, not necessarily as a pass rusher, but because they had so much of an issue setting the edge against the run in 2024. That's what he was brought in to do along with Dorrance Armstrong. And I do think Kinlaw was a much better signing than I thought it would be for the money, and I think he'll be a significant player. There just has to be more around him, and he's got to play his position. You know, he and Payne ended up playing, out of position over the last half of the season because there was no Wise and no Armstrong. And Martin couldn't be, an 80% snap guy. But yes, defensively, it would have been nice had they done more. I'm not so sure they didn't try to do more and that it wasn't just, there for them. Because in free agency, it's not, you're not picking, you're pitching.